Welcome to this presentation on ADHD definition and impact. I was asked to do this workshop after a hallway conversation about the students with ADHD who are granted extensions but still don't finish their work, and how difficult advisors found this, particularly when students knew it was important to finish. Before I get going, I wanted to give you some background on why I've been involved in this. I've been working with students with ADHD since the early 90s. My first real job, after being a waitress for a zillion years, was as a coordinator of the tech center as part of accessibility services at the University of Winnipeg. I was there for about 15 years. And one of the group of students that I worked with most closely and was most involved in were the students with learning disabilities, attention deficit disorder, some brain injury folks. And in fact, it was the skills that I developed in that job that helped move me into my position as in the Academic Learning Center. Further to this, I had two kids, and both were diagnosed with ADHD. My oldest is also on the ASD, on the autism spectrum range. He was diagnosed with ADHD in grade 1, primarily because, and a learning disability as well, primarily because I was very aware of how ADHD manifests and how learning disabilities manifest. So I insisted on him getting tested. And then my youngest was diagnosed in grade 4. She manifested hyperactively, which meant the school was very invested in getting her tested, which is more often true than not. And then in my 40s, I had myself diagnosed, and I was pretty sure I had it. It's hereditary. In fact, I'm pretty sure my husband has it too. I think we double whammied our kids. But ADHD, I think about 80% of people with ADHD inherited it from a family member. So it's very hereditable. So it wasn't a huge surprise to me. So needless to say, I have lots of personal investment with this topic. And then in the last year, after continuing to be consistently referred students with ADHD by both counseling and SAS, I got my coaching certificate. So I work also as a coach with students with ADHD. So that's my background. So I'm hoping that this presentation will give you some context for why this happens, why ADHD happens or how it happens, and then potentially a few strategies for how to respond. Okay. So I'm going to start with a basic definition of ADHD via DSM-5, explain some basic neurology and how we currently understand development and how these are impacted by ADHD. I will then review attention, working memory, and time blindness, and energy as well, and finish up with some of the strategies I use when working with students with ADHD and highlight some that I think can be relatively easily integrated into your work as an advisor. So the DSM-5 criteria for ADHD is a persistent pattern of inattention and/or hyperactivity, impulsivity that interferes with functioning or development. The appearance of symptoms need to appear before the age of 12, be present in 2 or more settings, so for example, school or home, interfere or reduce quality of social or academic or occupational functioning, and are not better explained by another mental disorder. So for a while I worked with Dawn in counseling, and we ran an LD clinic. And one of the first questions we ask, and I still ask this often, is this: have you been dealing with this kind of difficulty since childhood. How long have you been dealing with this? So in most cases, people are born with it. It can happen through brain injury, and sometimes through things like fetal alcohol syndrome, but in most cases, you're born with it. And when a person is diagnosed with ADHD, they are put into a subtype. They're either inattentive type, that's the daydreamy kid at the back of the classroom. Hyperactive impulsive type, those are the ones most often tested because they're the ones who are front and center in the classroom and can be the most disruptive. And then there's the combined type, which is a combination of inattentive and hyperactive. So what's also really important to understand is that ADHD does not go away, but it can modulate, or it can be modified, or individuals learn to adapt and work around it. And so it can become less apparent. And people who may be impacted significantly in a setting, say like school or at home. So trouble with paying bills, or really messy house, or getting work done at school, might really excel and be exceptional at work, because how the kind of work they are doing suits their how they function, how they think. It suits them neurologically in a sense. And so that's where you run into people saying, there's no way that person has ADHD. They're phenomenally talented, and we don't see that happening, but in fact they do. So putting aside the DSM-5 definition, I want to focus on a more current definition that is used more often when people talk about ADHD. And it's not that it's different than or counter to what DSM-5 puts forward, but the DSM-5 is interested in diagnosis, and this definition is more to explain or put ADHD in context. So this is again from Thomas Brown, who I really like, and he says, a complex syndrome of developmental impairments of executive functions, the self-management system of the brain, a system of mostly unconscious operations. These impairments are situationally variable, chronic, and significantly interfere with the functioning in many aspects of the person's life. So I'm going to be talking first about the developmental impairments, because I think that provides a really important groundwork for understanding how this diagnosis, or how having ADHD seriously impacts people's lives. And it puts some things in context too when you're working particularly with students who are between the age ranges of 18 and say 22, 23. I think it'll give you some context. So I'm just going to start with some basic developmental concepts. This is from another really huge person in the ADHD field, Barkley, and he's really big. If you're interested in watching stuff about ADHD, he has some excellent lectures on ADHD online. But word of warning, he tends to look at the impairment aspect. He's far more focused on the negative aspects of ADHD, which is understandable because there are lots. So I found them sometimes discouraging to listen to, but at the same time, they are so full of useful information. So I highly recommend them. But everyone goes through these 4 stages. And everyone, unless they're dealing with other developmental issues, but in most cases, everyone make these shifts by the time they're 30, and that includes people with ADHD. So we start with seeing everything as external, and then all information is external, and then we move to internal, which is nonverbal working memory, which I'll talk about in a bit. Um, uh, so we move from needing to say, oh, I need to, mommy, I shouldn't have said that, or doing things to remind us not to say things externally. You can see the little kids do this all the time, to making it more internal. So you say, oh yeah, I shouldn't be saying that, in your brain. And also you tend to internalize it in terms of, you're not even, it becomes unconscious. So we do things unconsciously that we've sort of developmentally developed. We move from other controlled to self-control. Then we move from the concept of time, which is now or not now, to being more future focused. And this begins to happen around the ages of the early 20s. And then that whole not eating the marshmallow study that they did, that concept of immediate gratification to delayed gratification. And this develops over time. But the important thing to remember is that with ADHD, it's a developmental, as I say, developmental impairment. And what researchers have found is that there is about a 3 to 5 year delay in the development of those skills for people with ADHD. So if you're working with an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old, developmentally, in terms of these skills only, right? In terms of the idea of self-control, future thinking, and delayed gratification, and potentially with internal nonverbal working memory, all 4 of those things, they are going to be more at the 12 or 13, 14-year-old range in doing that. So think of that teenager, what that teenager is like when they were 14 or 15. And the 18 or 19-year-old is going to be more in that range. So that can really help to put that into context when you're working with them. Intellectually, in terms of their ability to understand concepts, in terms of thinking in the classroom, in terms of doing well on tests, they're fine. They're at their age range. It's those other factors of their development that are delayed. Okay, so, and to be frank, I've never acted my age. So, and one of the frustrating things about being a person with ADHD is sort of getting to my late 50s, holy man, and beginning to think, oh, it would have been nice to be at this stage 10 years ago or 20 years ago, but there you go. Okay, so then we're going to move from so you have understanding of development and how it impairs development. And then we're going to talk about its impairments of executive functions, which is the self-management system of the brain. And these impairments are situationally variable, chronic. In other words, they don't go away, and they can significantly interfere with functioning. But I'm going to talk about the impairments of the executive functions. So, again, how the executive functions are classified varies across in the field. So the 2 big names on this are Brown, who I've already talked about, and Barkley, who I've already talked about. They're the 2 big guys that are doing work in this area. And on the whole, I like the more complex understanding of Brown, but I think in this case it's useful to talk about Barkley's definitions because they're a little bit simpler and more focused. So Barkley talks about the development of executive functioning skills and the developmental stage of those executive functioning skills, and he divides them into 4. So he has nonverbal working memory, verbal working memory, emotion regulation, and planning and problem solving. And nonverbal working memory is the first thing that children develop, first thing that we develop. And it involves being able to create a visual picture seeing ourselves in the past or future, remembering things, hindsight, going through an event and beginning to think about what worked and what didn't work, self-awareness, self-monitoring, metacognition, that idea of thinking about how you're functioning in the world, being aware of your impact on others, managing time, how things work in time, deferring gratification, all of those things are nonverbal working memory, okay? And all of those things can be problematic for people with ADHD. And in fact, with some, they cannot actually pull up visual images. They cannot see themselves in another context. They have no ability to put themselves there. It's just not possible for them. It's like being blind in that particular way. So people with ADHD who have trouble with nonverbal working memory will have trouble reactivating past events. They have trouble holding a number of mental images at once. So they would have a really hard time with rules of games and understanding how they work. They could be having trouble with reading, complex social cues. All of those things impact nonverbal working memory. And then we move from, as we develop, we move from nonverbal working memory to verbal working memory. And verbal working memory is being able to read voice, verbal cues, problem solving and introspection, formulating rules and plans, applying rules in new situations, reading comprehension, moral reasoning. So verbal working memory can impact ADHD with reading. So if they don't have a significant verbal working memory, they will have forgotten the first part of the sentence by the time they get to the last part of the sentence. Or with my daughter, who struggles with this a little bit, unless she's completely engaged with the book, she can forget what she read by the time if she puts it down for a day and she comes back, she'll have forgotten what she has read. Rigidity, you'll sometimes see that some individuals with ADHD are really rigid, really black and white, and it's because they have trouble applying rules they've learned into new situations. So that flexibility is problematic. Emotion regulation is the next thing developed, and also is an executive function. Emotions both arouse us to act and prevent us from acting. I'm quoting Brown here. And those controlling these emotions depend on both verbal and nonverbal memory. Awareness of past events and self-talk help us navigate those emotions, right? One of the things that I work with students is that learning how to self-talk, learning how to add context to situation and figure out different responses as they're dealing with things. And then planning and problem solving is the final thing, and Barclay calls this the mind's playground. It's where we do our big thinking, where we figure things out, where it gets can be a real strength in someone with ADHD or not, depending on who they are. But it can get problematic for people when they can't think on their feet, when they have trouble to get or stay organized, or with writing, which is something that I worked with a lot. I have really had a real problem with it, and I'm getting better and better. Yeah, by the time I'm 80, I'll be brilliant. Struggle to put ideas in the right order. Okay. So I'm going to go through this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but this is Brown's executive functions. And I just wanted to show it because I think it's useful to see the slide, and because you begin to see how these executive functions sort of play out. So you have activation, getting started on a task, focus, effort, emotion, memory, and action. Okay. Okay. So out of these, I'm going to talk about motivation, and then I'm going to talk about memory, and in particular working memory and accessing recall, but primarily working memory. And then I'm going to talk about time, which I don't think is in this list, but time blindness is a huge issue with people with ADHD, including myself. And being aware of it is really critical. Okay, and then finally talk about energy. So motivation, attention, and focus. So again, a reminder is that ADHD is partly due to the timing and amount of chemical release. So when the neurons are firing and so necessary connections aren't made, our spark plugs aren't firing correctly. So and one of those reasons is that they have abnormalities in the anticipatory dopamine cell firing in the reward system. So we don't get those sort of chemical or those neurological sort of things saying, oh, this is good, this makes us feel good, right? And it makes it difficult for them to arouse and sustain motivation for activities that do not provide immediate and continuing reinforcement. That's why people with ADHD can easily get addicted to phones, Facebook, Twitter, social media, video games, because they provide that immediate continuing reinforcement. Also, you'll also see people with ADHD often in high octane jobs because they provide that all the time. Okay. So I have a series of slides here based on a online presentation done by a guy named Dan Duncan. He's an ADHD coach in British Columbia. He, like me, also has ADHD. And he has a great presentation that you can also go watch. I can send people the link that talks about the differences in ADHD brain between ADHD and non-ADHD brain in terms of focus and attention. And I asked his permission to use these pictures and he gave me permission. So I'm doing this legitimately. Really nice guy. He it was nice talking with him. But for the non-ADHD brain, so you'll notice that there is a vertical axis of attention and horizontal of interest, right? And for the non-ADHD brain, we all have a period, the hypofocus, insufficient focus, when our interest is very low and so our attention is low, right? I don't want to pay attention to that. And that can be with all kinds of things, right? It can be just, it's irrelevant, so I don't need to pay attention, or it's really boring and so I'm not paying attention. But it's pretty small. And then and then there's the intersection of attention and interest down here that is fairly soon, and it grows as our interest grows. So normally, right? So, and you'll notice that the range for a non-ADHD brain is quite broad, and so there is lots of room to move for the non-ADHD brain in terms of attention. So now I'm going to show you a chart that shows you the ADHD brain. And here you'll notice that the range is much smaller. So, and the area of hypofocus, insufficient focus, is much wider, much bigger. There's a large hypofocus range. And one of those reasons is because of the lack of dopamine firing. And so that we need that external stimulation, that interest, to get us focused. So we need sort of, it's like, and that's where medication can be really valuable. And I'm not going to talk about medication at all in this presentation, but that's one of its functions. So here, and then, but you'll also notice something different, interesting, which is that the increase, the uptake in interest or attention is steep, really fast, if the interest is big, and we have that hyper focus where you are in the flow, where you're completely absorbed in the task, is also much bigger. So I say that one of ADHD's superpowers is that we can get into flow in many ways more often and more for a longer period of time than the non-ADHD brain, as long as we are very interested in the task that we are doing. So if we are engaged, we can spend hours and hours. And I can attest to this, we can block out the world around us. So from personal experience, both as for myself and from living with people that have it, and from working with students that have it, the world could explode behind me while I am engaged in a task that I'm very interested in, and I will not hear it because my complete focus is on that task. However, the problem, the anti-superpower, is the fact that if I'm not interested, or if individuals with ADHD are not interested, we really struggle to pay attention. So, and then thinking back to the conversation that I had in the hallway, we switched the axis, the horizontal axis, to importance, right? And even if the task is incredibly important, right? Let's look at the far end of the horizontal axis of importance. But the individual with ADHD is not interested in that task, or it does not find it interesting, or it does not stimulate them. And I think that's probably a better way to look at it, rather, because it's not a choice, it's unconscious. And that's another thing to really, really be aware of, is that with these executive functions, none of how we respond to it is by choice. Take my word for it. So that everything has to be conscious and aware in order to manage this. One of the analogies I use is that when you're learning to drive a standard car, or when I learned to drive a standard car, I was paying attention to RPMs and when I shifted and how the car felt when I was doing all of that. And there was a certain point where I stopped thinking about it and just did it, right? Like I knew how to shift from one gear to another, and I no longer was thinking about it. It was unconscious. Being ADHD with executive functions and managing those executive functions means that often we're consciously always having to be aware of the RPMs and the shifting. It never becomes unconscious, right? So if you have an individual, particularly someone who has been newly diagnosed or who is still struggling to figure out their ADHD, they will, despite knowing that it's a really important thing for them to do, and they know it, they agonize over it, are unable to pay attention. And you'll notice that it barely makes it into the attention area. And so their hypofocus, their lack of attention, is much larger if it's not of interest, even if it's important. Okay. So just again, it's the interest that will keep us moving forward. So I'm going to move forward to working memory, which really impacts. So let's say the individual is interested and focused on the task, or working to get interested and focused on the task. They then run into working memory issues. So working memory, there are 3 limitations of working memory. One is space, how much we can hold in our working memory. When we're younger, we hold 4, and then we do 5 after 25. So we have sort of up to about 25, we can hold about 5 items. After 25, it goes back down to 3 or 4 items. I can't even read my own chart here. but not consistently, but 88 ADDers or ADHD, people with ADHD can hold about 2 to 3 items at a time. More if the items are in an area of high interest. So I'm an avid reader. My working memory when it comes to reading and characters and authors and contexts are excellent. And if you talk to someone with ADHD about their area of expertise or where they're highly interested, they are capable of doing more. But on the whole, they really struggle with keeping more than 2 or 3 things in their working memory. Time, working memory, how long it takes to receive and process information, how quick and or how slow they are. Some people with ADHD are really fast processors, and some people are extremely slow. And the amount of effort that it takes to keep focused and use information in the moment. So if the effort is too much, often people with ADHD will tune out. It's like, yeah, I'm overloaded. I can't do that. And we've all experienced that when we're tired, right? When we're really tired or when we're stressed, we will have moments where it's like, yeah, no, I'm not going there. I can't do that right now. I can't process you or doing that at the same time. I run into that when I'm cooking, and some days I can chat with my daughter and cook, and some days it's like, stop talking. I can only do one thing at a time, right? But also understand that interruptions and distractions can totally destroy working memory. And so what I work with students on is how to create sort of those bubble spaces where they can really minimize distractions. But that is also can be the dangers of phones, right? Where they're needing the stimulation, they're frustrated with the task, they're having trouble putting the effort in, and then they're looking for that dopamine thing, and they go to Twitter or something like that, or TikTok, I guess now. Okay, so added to that is time blindness. So things are now or not now. And again, this is related to executive function. Again, it's unconscious. Someone with ADHD sees the thing that's immediately in front of them. You as an advisor know they're about to go over the waterfall, but they cannot see that. They are focused on whatever fish they're catching at the moment. And this is compounded by, we have a very inaccurate sense of time passing. When interested, it passes very quickly. When not interested, it passes so slowly it's painful. We all have those moments, so that's not unusual. But people with ADHD have actual physical responses to pouring text. It actually physically can hurt. But also they just don't have a good sense of what 15 minutes means, or what 45 minutes means, or what a day means, or anything. So what I do with a lot of students is start to make that sense of time visual in a way that is meaningful for them, and give them ways of monitoring time that is more that can be more helpful. Okay, and then the other thing that is problematic for someone with ADHD is prospective memory, which is remembering to remember. So things like calling to make a doctor appointment, or picking up library books at a certain time, or returning library books at a certain time, or taking medication. All of these things are huge. It's something actually that I deal with quite actively. And I put timers on my phone so that I'll remember. But this is a consistent issue. And again, it's unconscious. And it's, again, something that we have no control over. And then difficulty with estimating time, which harks back to working memory. Okay, so all of this, then, so you're thinking about someone, executive functions that we all have are unconscious, that we don't think about them. They just happen. And with people with ADHD, because they're impacted, a lot of times they have to put extra effort into making things happen, and sometimes have to make those things um, explicit, right? Say them out loud. Or think about me and the RPMs and shifting gears. They have to do this consciously all the time. And all of that takes energy. And energy for people with ADHD is limited. One of the people who trained me for my academic coaching certificate talked about it as, we're better sprinters than marathoners. And I would say that's very true. So I can see students who, fairly high functioning students with ADHD, who will do the 3-4 days of writing papers, studying for exams, and then be done. They're finished. They can't do any more, and they can't do any more for a long time. And they really struggle with this one, because the adrenaline that comes from that kind of sprint is phenomenal, and they feel like they can do this forever. What I said is, when I'm in one of my sprints, if I could be like this, I would be Martha Stewart, right? Shows my age. But like, just that ability to get things done is phenomenal. But the price that students pay is huge, and it can build up. So I often run into students who are like totally out of steam by the end of November, or by mid-March, where they just don't have any energy anymore. And then it becomes like, what is the bare minimum that you can do to keep going to get over the finish line? Okay. So 2 more slides and then we're done. Other aspects of ADHD that I don't have time to talk about, but perfectionism, because they see the ideal, but they can't match it. This leads to procrastination. They have a really hard time with transitions and getting out of flow or getting into flow. Emotional liability, difficulty modulating emotional responses. That's something certainly I struggle with, particularly when I'm tired and stressed. Black and white thinking, this has trouble with applying new rules and adjusting to new rules so they can be rigid. Automatic negative thoughts, which are ants, which leads to overwhelm. Like, they get overwhelmed with things, and that negative rumination, which is, I'm a failure, I can't do this, I always do this. The thing about people with ADHD is they often are very aware of how other people function, and that they don't do the same, right? And they take it on themselves. They do not see it. They see it as their fault, as their failure. And the positive illusory bias, they think they're doing better than they are. And then that is contrasted with negative self-image, which comes out of the overwhelm and rumination, which is the automatic negative thoughts. Okay, so that's ADHD in a nutshell, or it gives you a little sense of it. Strategies I use and share with students. Number 1 and most important is compassion and praise. I provide positive reinforcement. I reframe negative to positive where I can, without discounting things that didn't work. But I always look for what they've done well, what has worked, and what will continue to work for them. And I reframe it out of the personal failure into okay, this is the thing that you have, and then let's look at things that you have no control over and how you can adjust to them. I encourage verbal processing where it works. Some students need to talk out loud. They need to talk through what they're experiencing. It can be really frustrating when you're an advisor and you have a limited amount of time, but that verbal processing can be really useful for the student. And if you listen carefully, you can often pull things from it that can help you reframe what they're dealing with. Getting them to externalize information, lists, calendars, reminders, instructions, with the understanding that all of these things can be problematic, and that they will lose calendars. So you have to find out what they use and what's effective for them. But lists can be really useful. I've sent more students away with Post-it notes, ask them where they're going to put their Post-it notes, and then sort of check up with them what they've done with them, how that's worked. Make time physical. I really encourage students with ADHD to get watches and not use phones, and use alarms. Make explicit the need for external reinforcers. External motivation is so key. It's amazing. This internal motivation stuff is highly overrated with people with ADHD. They need that praise. They need to know that there's something that's going to happen that's positive at the end of that, that they need to have a reason, a purpose for what they're doing. Replace distractions with reinforcers, and that's something that I would do. Probably don't need to do that, but sometimes like Post-it notes will work. Externalize rules and make instructions explicit, and make sure they understand the instructions, because you could be talking, they could be nodding their head, and they will have told, if they're overloaded, if their working memory is gone, if they've lost you, they're going to be nodding and not hearing a word that you're saying. Break tasks down, create routines that incorporate rewards, and prepare for the unexpected. Know that they have a limited number of spoons in the drawer, as in a limited amount of energy, and that needs to go into planning their term, and that you should encourage self-care. And that's it. I'm hoping that I will be there to answer questions.